Hi, Susie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you today because you've done a fair bit of research into men's issues and male suicide. So, to start off, what is it specifically about men that cause them to commit suicide more frequently than women and have these kind of mental health issues more prominently?
Um, well, it's suicide's a very complicated behaviour. Probably in the repertoire of human behaviours, it's in the upper percentile of complexity, given its consequences for what happens if you do it. So there are many, many different factors that converge on somebody's decision to not want to be in existence anymore, and they range from biological factors that we're not aware of, potentially to do with our genetics or experiences in our childhood, how our sort of emotional regulation develops, our sense of self, our ability to form relationships with other people, work opportunities, cultural factors that may mark us as different and expose us then to stigma or prejudice, social, economic factors. There's so many different reasons why somebody might be in so much pain that they don't want to be here anymore. But we do see more men taking their lives than women. So in the UK, for the last set of statistics we had, it was three-quarters of suicide deaths were male. And that's pretty consistent. I think suicide records began being collected in the UK in 1861. And basically, for every year since, there's been more male deaths recorded than female. So there's certainly a gendered component to the behaviour. There's certainly um, a bias towards men feeling that in certain moments of intense distress, that feels like the only way to resolve their pain. Now, there are going to be biological reasons, potentially, why men are more at risk. And that's not what I look at. I don't look at those sort of biological factors, but I don't want to in any way diminish them. They are a very important part of this conversation. I can't illuminate what those might be. And then there are and what I mean by that is that there are biological differences between men and women. So there are potentially some of those differences may be driving that elevated suicide risk in men. And then there are also gender differences in men and women. So there are different ways in which culture tells men to behave and different ways that culture tells women to behave. And that's more of what I look at. How do those ideas from our cultures shape our psychology, shape how we think and feel about ourselves and the people around us? And when we start to look at those gendered ideas of masculinity, and so just to be very clear, I'm not talking about aspects of men that are biological, that are fixed, that are part of men's nature. I'm talking about these external ideas that we're all socialized in about how men should behave. And when we start to look at some of those gendered ideas, we've identified three areas where we think men may be more potentially at risk because of those specific cultural ideas around male behavior. And the first set of ideas is around emotions. So, how men are often socialized in their emotions. So, this idea that you need to suppress certain emotions and deny certain aspects of vulnerability and pain, and how that can contribute for some men to a sense of denial about their emotional state of being, a disconnection from that state of being, which can then, as problems mount in life, contribute to sort of dysregulation in that area of their lives. So we see that as one area of risk, how these cultural ideas around men's emotions may cause this dysregulation for some men in that sort of psychological domain. And then the second set of cultured ideas is around male success. So, how men think and feel about themselves. So, we see the possibility that there are very clear ideas potentially in cultures around what makes a successful man. And for the men that feel like they don't live up to those markers, there's this danger that they internalize this very painful feeling of failure, this painful feeling that they, as an individual man, have not lived up to expectations, that they are a failure, they're not contributing what they should be or achieving what they should be. And so we see then this sort of dysregulation in feelings towards self. And sometimes that can then manifest in men um, not only having these sort of painful feelings of failure, but then suppressing them and performing, as it were, to the outside world that they're okay, performing that they're in control and that they're happy. And then we start to potentially get into this dangerous psychological terrain where what you're presenting to the external world is at such a different distance, to what you're feeling inside, and then the profound sort of isolation that can come along in those scenarios. So that's the second psychological domain where we see sort of cultured ideas having a potential impact on men and increasing their pain and suicide risk. And then the third area is around men's relationships needs. So again, here we see how cultured ideas for men to be independent, to suppress their emotions, to cope alone, to be successful, can sort of separate men in some ways from meaningful connection with other people that we all need. And we see evidence of men experiencing sort of profound loneliness and isolation, issues trusting other people, relationship challenges and conflict. So that's sort of the third sort of psychological area where we see these cultured ideas having an impact. And the important thing to bear in mind is that these things aren't in isolation. So if I'm feeling like a failure, that's creating painful feelings that I might then be emotionally suppressing, which is then creating distance from if I'm not talking to my partner about it, it's then creating this sort of loneliness and isolation in my relationship. So those sort of three psychological areas are all in interaction with one another at the same time. So that's kind of a very long response to your answer of saying these are the sort of three primary areas that we've identified where cultural ideas may be elevating men's risk. Of course, that's not the complete story. And just to stress again, there will be biological factors that I'm sure elevate men's risk that it's not my area of expertise, but certainly we've sort of started to identify areas that we think could be key.
Those three issues do sound particularly interlinked. I feel like one would very obviously lead to the other in terms of, say,
Yeah.
you don't have a lot of success, and then you feel the need you want to tell people like, oh, I don't feel enough because I'm not successful enough, but instead you emotionally suppress it and then push people away, and then that ends up
Yes,
being like a triad of things that culminate into the
exactly.
suicidal tendencies. So do you find that those three things very strongly point towards someone then reaching that point of wanting to commit suicide?
I think what they point towards is people feeling tremendous sort of psychological pain. And basically, psychological pain is kind of an umbrella term for emotions that are unpleasant. So it could be, I think of every person having a sort of cocktail of their own psychological pain because we've all had different experiences in life that have made us feel that kind of pain. Um, but for some of us, that may manifest as sort of anxiety and depression. For other people, it may be sort of jealousy or guilt or shame. There's all sorts of different emotions within it. But the thing is that those emotional states are unpleasant to be in. They're painful. It's And so often what we see suicide described as is as a way to escape kind of unbearable pain. So I think of suicide in a way as a manifestation of that pain. So in some ways, I'm not so much studying suicide as studying men's pain, psychological pain. And for men different men that will manifest in different ways. For some men, it may manifest in sort of addiction or you know risk taking behaviors, or there's lots of different ways in which we respond. For some people, it can be what drives incredibly beautiful things that they do, like becoming doctors or paramedics, or you want to help other people because you don't want others to be in the pain that you're in. I think pain can be also a tremendously a driver of real compassion at the same time as a driver of real destruction. And often what people need are better tools to regulate their pain with, so that they can focus it in a more life orientated way.
It sounds to me like a lot of men have very ineffective coping strategies that end up kind of making the problem worse rather than making it better.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying. And I think the thing is that what we need to problematize within that is culture rather than men themselves, rather than saying you're a bad person who's picked a bad coping strategy. You probably picked, in a way, sometimes, when you look at people's lives, and if your culture and society are telling you don't talk to people about what's going on with you, hide your feelings, be successful, the space with which you can sort of effectively cope with your problems becomes narrower and narrower. And so I think within those contexts, sometimes people are reaching for the most readily available coping strategies, which may bring them short-term relief. Like if I go out tonight, yeah, and get really drunk, it might take my mind off things, but over the long term, it's going to be potentially more detrimental to me. So, but really, in some ways, every single human being is engaged in a process of learning how to regulate that pain, because we're all exposed to pain. And there'll be times in our lives when that pain is less, and there'll be times in our life when that pain is more, but we're always potentially at risk from it. And we, each of us, have to find ways to cope with it. And it is learning those different tools that are going to, as I said before, like direct you in a path that's orientated towards life and uh, growth rather than destruction. But I also understand that that's not always easy, and the options available to people can be incredibly, narrow.
Yeah, I was thinking that potentially, I don't know how accurate this might be, but in my head at least, how
Yeah.
from young, as like in the education system and stuff, a lot of boys are, because they mature a lot later than girls, they're kind of told to like sit still, be quiet, all those kind of things. And they don't have the right outlet for that kind of emotion, like how they might want to express how they're feeling in like a more physical way, for example. So then as they grow up, they might potentially not work out what that outlet is, which then may lead into later life. I'm not sure how accurate that is. Do you think that might be a factor in how boys may never actually develop that way to have an outlet for their emotion because from young they're kind of taught to just suppress it rather than express it in the way that they feel most natural?
Mm. I think it's hard to unpack in a way because we are uh, sort of gendered from so early on in our lives. It's hard to understand what's a biological impulse for men to want to process emotions in a specific way, and what's been a sort of culturally inherited idea. But I do think that it's, whatever the reality is, I think that we have to have a broader understanding of how emotions present, how men want to manage their emotions, and that sometimes we can have quite feminized ideas about what that needs to look like. For, certain men, it makes no sense to them to sit down with somebody and talk about their feelings. Which, if you've been told your whole life to deny your emotional state, I mean, it makes a lot of logical sense that you would then struggle to understand why that would be, um, a valuable endeavor. But I think the thing that's absolutely critical, like two things that I want to say, is that there's definitely evidence in my research about the sort of violence of emotional suppression in terms of its consequence for some men's well-being. At the same time, I've always found if you give men the time and space and a sense of safety, in the sense that you're actually there to really hear what they have to tell you about their experiences, then men who are suicidal are some of the most emotionally articulate and wise and profound people that I've ever spoken to. And so it's not always that they um, aren't able to express their emotions, as in don't have that skill set within themselves, but it's a lacking sometimes of a safe space in which to, um, to do that. Um, and then I had a second point, which I've now has completely disappeared out my head. Uh,
I can give you a second, or I can add to that if you want.
Add to it, and I will see if it comes.
I was just going to say it's almost ironic, really, that you could argue the men who are suicidal have probably sat with their emotions and processing arguably a lot more than the average person who never really even got to
Absolutely,
that place in the first place. So them being wise kind of makes a lot of sense, actually, because
yeah.
they've sat and gone. The fact that they've reached the point where their only option feels like they have to die means they must have done a lot of thinking and a lot of processing of how they actually feel. Whereas the people who have suppressed it and haven't yet reached that point probably haven't had the mental battle with themselves. They've kind of just push it to the side in that sense. And I think you're totally right. I think because a lot of social media campaigns say things like "men get talking" or something generic along those lines, and I feel like I mean, it's helpful that it's mentioned, but I feel like that's such a bare minimum. Like, I think it's not particularly productive to tell a lot of men who don't even know how to get talking in the first place to get talking. I feel like there's then probably should be sorts of therapy or ways to tailor mental health services to be more welcoming to how men express their feelings. I feel like currently it's not tailored in a way that men feel like it's approachable.
I completely agree with what you're saying, and that is a big recommendation of ours, that we really need to understand how men who are suicidal want to be supported, and that's going to look. The thing is, when we talk about men, we're obviously not talking about a generic type of person. Like, there's so much diversity in men, and some men absolutely will love going to therapy and really flourish under a sort of therapeutic relationship. And there are other men that where completely different kinds of interventions are going to be um, valuable for them. But until we do the work to really talk to men who are suicidal and understand the ways in which they will want to be supported, then I agree there's a certain futility in just saying to men to talk. And I think we also have to acknowledge that there's this strange situation that I think we're in culturally at the moment, where on the one hand, men are being encouraged to talk. There's a recognition that men aren't talking about the things that are painful for them. And at the same time, we're sort of having this social conversation about men and masculinity as something toxic and privileged. And so, and when you put those two ideas together, they're not really conducive, in my opinion, to someone feeling that they have the psychological safety to express their vulnerability in an environment where it's going to be compassionately heard. And I think you would really struggle to find any human being that wants to tell you the thing that they're most sort of distressed about to somebody that they feel could be hostile towards them, because it's such a um, vulnerable thing to do. And so I think that, there's we have to do some reflection as a culture and a society in how we're thinking about men and talking about men, and really ask ourselves, are we extending the same amount of compassion to men as we are to other groups of people?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I feel like a lot of men feel like not saying anything anymore because I've
Mm,
purely off social media. I feel like I'm definitely too online for this, and I feel like the sentiment to real people is very different to people on Twitter or people on Instagram. But I will say it anyway. Like a lot of times when a man will say they have a problem, at least on the internet, you'll see the replies, and it's mainly women going, "You're a man, like you don't get to complain about your problems. You've had it. You guys have
yeah, yeah,
everything. You
yeah,
have it so
yeah,
good." I'm like,
yeah.
just because they may have everything in some aspect, it doesn't then invalidate their other problems. I feel like it's kind of a weird discourse, and I think there's a double standard in what you can say about some people and what you can say about others. I think you mentioned you were doing a podcast with the Tin Men,
Mm,
and you said that there was a card in a pretty
oh,
famous
yeah,
British museum that said, I like everyone, even even men or something like that. And you
Yeah,
said that if you put the shoe on another foot of another group, you just would never have that. And it's just a weird. And most men would be like, haha, that's funny. We just deal with that kind of stuff. That's the kind of humor that we're used to, which is fine in a certain context. And as long as people know it's like a joke from a friend, but I feel like you catch the wrong person on the wrong day, that
yeah,
can really it obviously everything in context, but I feel like that as a thing to sell from a large
yeah.
yeah, it's like that's
It's
the
not
kind of thing you
okay.
send to your friend as
Yeah,
a joke on Instagram. You don't make a card out of it and sell it to people. I feel like that's like a different level of okay, maybe we've crossed the line here.
I agree. And I think, like, of course, there has to be humor between us. Like, we have to be able to laugh at life and the problems and challenges that we're facing. But the thing is, if I can make a joke about a certain group of people, that it's not okay for me to make that joke about other people, then there's a double standard that comes in there. That then when you start to unpack it, like, why is it okay to make that joke about men? Well, if the logic is, well, because men have all the power and they've had it good for so long and everything else, you're talking about, in my view, a minority of very, very materially privileged men who've had a tremendous amount of power. And I think probably if you met them, you would find them emotionally pretty bankrupt. So I don't know that they're necessarily emotionally privileged, but certainly materially privileged. But huge swathes of men that have never known that level of privilege. And so the logic behind then, for example, of why it might be okay to make that joke towards men doesn't hold up for me. Actually, what you're doing is just dismissing the reality of um, a majority of people. And the thing is as well, there's when you're in distress and somebody comes up to you and goes, kind of, what are you unhappy about? You've had everything. Like, it's so shaming. It's so diminishing, and the pain is still then inside of you. It's just been compounded now by uh, the shamingness of somebody rendering it completely invisible. I think that there's a sort of a double standard that's not helpful to what we're trying to achieve, which is just making the complexity of existence more bearable for as many of us, as possible. Because, by no means I mean, obviously, I study suicide in men, but there's, psychological distress is sort of a cancer in contemporary uh, society. So it's something that we're all implicated in. And I just find it so strange, like my well being as a woman is so dependent on the people in my life being okay. And many of them are men. Like, our lives are deeply entwined with one another, and the taking care of each other and being compassionate towards one another. And it's so paramount, I think, to us achieving more bearable lives.
Absolutely. I think another thing that you mentioned in your work was how a fair few men have had problems when they've approached mental health services and essentially been had bad experiences where they've been almost ridiculed and like not taken seriously. Do you think that how does that even happen in the first place is will be our first question. How do you get to the point where someone isn't even taken seriously even when they do reach out for help? And I can't imagine that gives people much hope who then do want to when they've heard bad stories about people reaching out
Yeah.
in the first place.
I mean, our evidence suggests that the men have had experiences where I have to say we have evidence of people going for help and having brilliant experiences, but there are absolutely
Of
evidence to
course, yeah.
suggest that some men have gone for help and had bad experiences. Sometimes it's about, if they present their distress in a very matter of fact way, then they're read as being relatively okay. They're read as not being. We're maybe primed to think that distress or somebody in real crisis is somebody who's very hysterical and out of control. So if a man's coming in a very contained way, speaking in a very sort of practical way almost about what's going on for him, he can be read as being more okay than he actually is, which again can be very sort of alienating and distressing when you've gone for help and somebody's interpreted what you're experiencing as not being as um, frightening as potentially it feels on the inside. Um, and then we've had evidence as well of people feeling in some cases like they weren't taken seriously, or finding that the therapy wasn't helpful or medication hasn't been helpful. So again, I think there's a big piece of work that we need to do around really speaking to men who are suicidal to understand the support that they need. If somebody thinks my life's on fucking fire because I got financial problems and I can't get a job, and somebody wants me to go and talk about my feelings or put me on medication, well, how's that going to help me get out of the sort of financial hole that I'm in? So it's there's lots of recommendations that we've made for how we need to improve services. And I think also as well, not everybody wants a medical response. Some people want, to listen to podcasts and try and find ways to tools to understand themselves a bit better, or go to a community group, or play uh, football with there's lots of different ways in which you can like regulate your pain, um, that don't have to be in a sort of medical model. Now, again, there are men for whom that is hugely beneficial. So it's very difficult sometimes when you talk about these things because there's no one size fits all kind of solution. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah, no, it was quite a lot of these questions are fairly open-ended anyway. I guess ideally in an ideal world you would have it so that a therapist could go by on a case-by-case basis, and rather than having like a formulaic way of, okay, this is the things they're saying, and then based on this we prescribe them this medicine and go to a therapy class once a week or something. You would be like, oh, okay, so tell me about what you do to get away from that stress, or actually asking them personal questions, and then they could
yeah,
be towards, oh, okay, actually, you probably wouldn't suit the normal thing that we do, but if you went to a jazz class and met new people, that might help
yeah,
you with your loneliness or something. Like a more tailored response
absolutely.
that would actually give people the connection they might potentially need, or the. For me, for example, I, to a fault, arguably, have quite a logical brain. So for me, when I have a
Mm,
interest in a certain topic, I will listen to infinitely amount of podcasts until or like YouTube videos or whatever, in like a weirdly obsessive way. And now I know too much about a really niche subject. So like if I was having distress, like my first port of call would be like, go on YouTube. How do I get over this problem? Like, and I don't know. I just do my information gathering sequence of just trying to absorb as much information as possible. And then I'm a very much a I don't really go off my gut. I go off trying to get as much information as possible and then
mm,
move. So if a therapist going, "Oh, how do you feel about that?" Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. I would be very objective. I'd like set out exactly what my life situation is, and they are based off that rather than I feel like this. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
mm,
I just think maybe it's not something a therapist has potentially been confronted with often.
mm,
Someone who thinks like that, where a lot of their decisions are more based purely off evidence rather than feel. One of the methods that about Marg Azule spoke to me last week, the men's therapy online, was retreats from men, and one of the like ritual things they did, which I'm not sure how much is placebo, but he said it seemed to work with a lot of people, was they would do like a difficult task, all of them together. So one thing they did was they like carried a rock up this like mountain thing, and
mm,
they like assigned it each of their trauma. So one of them's going through a divorce or financial time difficulties or whatever. And once they got to the top, they would just throw this stone down the mountain, almost as if to release that stress like off their back finally. And he said that that psychological weight kind of comes off their shoulders. So
mm,
maybe for men, it's something more practical. So I always find that I guess a lot of men feel like a lot more involved in they feel more that a lot of their problems stem from the incapability of doing things. So that accomplishment might actually help them feel like they're turning it around physically rather than mentally. They need an embodiment of it. They're more literal.
Mm. I think that's fascinating, and I think that sounds like a really uh, beautiful ritual. And I think as well that they so much, we feel in our bodies. We're biological beings responding to life, and I think that there is something about the physicality of processing pain, managing pain, that's really um, interesting and important, as well as sort of verbally sitting and explaining it and making sense of it. Um, and I agree, we all have our own ways of, that's great what you're saying about your understanding about the way that you manage your pain is like, and I think that's in some ways what's important for each person is just to figure out what do I need to do that's going to help me feel better. And there's kind of like short term fixes. So, like tonight, if I'm in a down way, what can I do immediately to sort of help regulate that? And then this more sort of longer term work that some of us may need if we've been through very complicated or challenging situations to really unpack what are the sort of long term legacies of that more sort of traumatic situation. A couple of things I just wanted to say. We're doing a study at the moment with health professionals to understand what their training needs are in terms of working with men who are suicidal. And the response has been phenomenal, and so many professionals that I've engaged with. I mean, obviously, everybody that's getting in touch with the study cares, but it has been really moving to meet so many health professionals who really, really want to be better at supporting men in crisis. So I do just want to flag that for anybody listening. Um, that the help isn't always we're not where we need to be in terms of really understanding what's going to be most effective. But there are so many professionals out there that care really um, deeply.
Absolutely. I think it's clearly something that's getting better, and I think there's a lot more people giving a voice to the voiceless in terms of raising awareness of these kind of issues. I think recently
Yeah,
it's becoming a lot. It's gone from being stigmatized to one advert I saw recently that was incredibly moving, and I it was quite a tearjerker for a lot of people. I'm not sure if you saw it for the Norwich City
yeah,
Football
yeah,
Club
yeah,
campaign. That was incredible advert. The like to summarize it is these two guys going to a football game every week, and one of them seems a bit low energy and lethargic, and like when his team score, he kind of like slowly stands up and claps, and the other guy is going wild at every decision from the referee, whatever. And then at the end of the video, like they've just won the game or whatever, and he puts his scarf around the like lower energy guy and says, "No, you keep it." And then the next game, he comes over and the seat is empty, and he leaves the scarf on the empty seat, almost in his memory. And it's like you, that is the epitome of men's ability to just shut up shop and
Mars.
not
Yeah,
show it at all, and almost show the opposite completely. Yeah.
yeah,
So I think that is probably not something a lot of people realized, and that diversion of expectations was quite shocking, but in a good way. It kind of pointed out, like, look, a lot of people just won't say anything at all. So it's really important to have the right conversations, even if you're not expecting that person who's so lively and high energy to even have those problems in the first place. So I think those kind of campaigns that are more thought provoking than, oh, let's just talk,
mm,
everybody, are
mm.
are a much better way of conveying that this is an important topic rather than just putting a generic statement out there that's like, okay, men should talk about their feelings. Like I feel like an actual message that's, yeah, like that I think is a better way of doing it for sure.
Absolutely. And that people experiencing thoughts of suicide can present in so many different ways and can look and be leading completely different and varied lives, and that you don't uh, cannot make assumptions about who's going to be vulnerable to it. Yeah, I thought it was a phenomenal advert. It was so powerful.
Exactly. I think another problem a lot of people may encounter is I was going to ask, how do you think is it even possible to find that balance of feeling quote unquote manly whilst also being able to regulate your emotion in a healthy way? Because I feel like a lot of people might feel that expressing their emotions often and might detract from their idealized self and masculine self. So how would someone try and balance the two where they feel like I'm the man of the house or something, or whatever kind of way they want to feel about themselves, whilst also simultaneously being able to express their emotions to the people who need to hear it?
Yeah, I mean, I have tremendous empathy for people that struggle with that. Like, I'm somebody, I find it so difficult to cry in front of people. I have a real, like, and I know that it's stupid. And I've never, I have lots of people cry at me, and I only ever think like beautiful, compassionate things about the person that's distressed. So it makes no sort of logical sense. But I understand that when you're somebody that's been self reliant in a deep way for a long time, it's so difficult to let yourself show vulnerability to other people. I think the thing that, and actually, you've reminded me now of the point I was trying to make earlier, and I think this is so critical, is that emotions are baked into our bodies. Like they've been evolving for millions and millions of years. They are part of our evolutionary survival toolkit, is to have a feeling state that is telling us things that we want to move towards, things that we want to move away from. So they are, you cannot be human without having some sort of feeling, vibration going on in your body. Sometimes that may be very loud, sometimes it may be so quiet you don't even hear it, but it's always happening. So for me, the thing about bringing men into connection with that state of being is not to feminize them in any way. It's bringing you back to a core aspect of being human. And again, I think that allowing that connection to re-happen, also understanding that that experience is happening all of the time, our emotions, and they can drive us in fucking crazy directions if we don't get a grip of them. It's a area of life in which we do need to have control over it, because it can drive so much of what we do. So I think there's a lot within how we frame and package emotions that could be very appealing for the male psyche, in the terms of like having like being able to like sort of better regulate yourself and have more control over your intentions, and manifesting your purpose, and things like that. And it's so vital, I think, for people to understand that this is part of being the human being. And what we also need to allow for at the same time, in your, to go back to your earlier point, is that we is allowing that to manifest in different ways for different people. There's not a one size fits all for how, what effective kind of emotional regulation necessarily looks like, or emotional expression. Like what you were saying about like the young boy in the classroom who maybe he needs to just get up and jump up and down for 5 minutes in order to then sit back down and be present for the class. Like that's as valid as somebody having a cry.
Absolutely. It's the way you harness your emotions is unique to you, and you can't, just because societal norms tell you that okay, so when you're sad you cry, and when you're happy you laugh, and when you're meant to be studying you sit in one place and you don't do anything other than do the one task and you focus on that one task. Like I think being able to appreciate people's individualism is much more important, and I guess being able to harness that emotion means that the life can come from you rather than life coming at you. I think.
Exactly.
I think
Exactly.
it's probably the
Beautifully
best way
put.
to put it, really. And it reminds
Yeah.
me a bit of, I've done a fair bit of reading about Stoic philosophy, and I found that a lot of people misinterpret it as, oh, you have no emotion, you just push everything off, and you just completely shut off your emotions. And I'd argue it's completely the opposite of that. And I find that there's a big misconception there with conflating not having emotions to actually, no, you do have emotions, but instead of letting them dictate your life, you instead you acknowledge them, notice they're there, and then act accordingly based off that, rather than using them as the driver for all of your actions, which I think is, for men, might be a better way of framing their ability to do emotions, and stuff like meditation and things like that might be able to help.
Absolutely. I think that's beautiful. I mean, what was it like for you growing up? Like, did you feel that at school and amongst your peer group? Did you feel that there was certain expectations around how you should be emotionally as a young
Yeah,
boy? And
I mean, I think there's a lot of, to put it in the most of like crude way possible, dick measuring that goes on at school.
mm,
I went to an all boys school as well, so it was even worse.
okay,
So that was just, it was just a lot of like everyone trying to outdo each other on that sense, like just from just because it was quite a fairly academic school as well, in the classroom or the football pitch or whatever sort of aspect. There was a lot of like, I found it was quite competitive, and I think that's just natural. Like teenagers can't help but compare themselves to other people constantly, especially because I grew up with social
mm,
media as well. That definitely didn't help. And I did feel at points like quite, I wasn't like the coolest kid. I was fine. I had friends. I didn't feel like I was victimized in any way, but I definitely felt the pressure sometimes to conform to, I don't know, like you get taken out in rugby or something and like you really hurt yourself, but you're not going to cry in front of all your peers, or you're not even going to pretend like it hurt. You're going to go, oh yeah, mate, no, absolutely nothing. Just carry on. And you're literally like screaming in pain inside. Like there is a,
mm,
like a thing there that I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but whatever it is, you do kind of subconsciously conform to what you think you're meant to be doing. And I think
mm,
adolescence really is the peak of that. I think now I feel like I'm more confident in my own skin, where I don't feel like I have to prove something to anyone. But at the time, I was really like, God, don't want XYZ person who I think's really cool or whatever thinking that of me. So I'll just do this so then
mm,
like, they don't look at me in a different way. Not that they would have cared
mm,
anyway, really. Everyone
mm.
thinks that you always think that you're the center of their attention, but they probably wouldn't have noticed. But at the time, everything like felt like the end of the world for sure.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well. One of the studies we did recently around sort of barriers to help seeking was, and this was quite prevalent amongst younger men, was this idea of still this idea that getting help was a weakness, but 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 these young men would frame it as, I wouldn't think less of my friend for doing it, but I cannot bring myself to do it. So it was like almost, yeah, almost being like, what's okay for other men that I know, um I can't give myself permission to do that.
I think it's more, it might even be like, especially for a teenager, like a social hierarchy thing.
Okay, yeah.
So to me, I don't mind someone losing their place on the ladder if it that's how they feel they want to do it. But I'm certainly not going to lose my place on the hierarchy by actually expressing how I actually feel, and to them being a softie or whatever you want to call it. So to them, I'm like, yeah, you go ahead, you shoot yourself in the foot in the social hierarchy, which is a horrible way to look at it. But at the time, you're like, well, if they can't deal with it, I'll profit from it. I'll look like the cooler one or whatever. And I think a lot of that comparison to a lot of people, it used to just be constrained to the classroom and the people you know. And now with social media, you're kind of doing it to the rest of the world. You're you even got things like someone being like, "Oh, I have more followers than you on Instagram, or I get more likes than you on Instagram," and it's such benign stuff that really doesn't matter at the end of the day. But 14-year-old you is can't believe. Like I remember somebody being to me like, "Oh, look at you! You only have X like likes on your Instagram, and you have this many followers. God, no one even likes your posts." And to me, I was like, "God, I feel like such a loser." And obviously now I'm like, that just doesn't matter at all. But at the time, you don't really know how to process it, so you just say something mean back because that's just how teenagers are. And I feel like potentially maybe a lot of men never grow out of that habit of just, I say something mean to you, they say something mean back, and you just use that as your coping mechanism.
Like your armor.
Yeah, exactly. It's a facade for what you're actually feeling. You just use it as a way to put the shields up. And I think the social media frame, I think, could and the growth of that, I can't imagine at all has really helped the mental health of anybody, let alone men. Um, so I imagine that's quite a big factor as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't study it, so I can't speak sort of from a scientific point of view about it. But I can tell you from a kind of personal perspective, I think it is unbelievably corrosive. I think it's so damaging and dangerous, and I think psychological well-being to a certain extent rests upon us believing that there's some safety in the world for us. And what for me social media does is introduce so much unsafety, because suddenly now you're being constantly scrutinized for your social value, how many likes you've generated, how many followers you have, and that you're directly as a 14-year-old kid getting feedback from other people to tell you don't have as much social value as others. It's just undermining that sense of like psychological safety. It's undermining our sense of self and like our value as a human being and sense of mattering, social value. I just think it is. And then the emotional dysregulation that comes along with that. Because suddenly, then, as a 14-year-old kid, you've got to process these feelings of shame and anxiety and panic that probably flooding through your body because somebody is, every time you post, then there must be an anxiety around how many people are going to like this. What if I don't get, and so you're like conditioning then your body the whole time to be exposed to these sort of anxious moments. And I mean, there's just on so many levels, I think it's so dangerous for, I mean, not just young people, adults as well. I think like none of us are equipped to deal with that amount of feedback on our potential social value in such an artificial setting that really doesn't have any bearing on on our value in the real world, but it's become so enormous that we start to feel like it does. And I just think it's the road to hell. Even though I post on Instagram, like, it is a great way to reach people, sorry, and communicate.
Hmm. Yeah, there's positives and negatives to everything as per usual, I guess. But I feel like for certain demographics, like younger kids, is the negatives definitely get exacerbated because they definitely aren't accessing the right kind of resources that would be useful to them realistically. They're looking at and comparing themselves to targets that probably aren't realistic for them to even aspire to. And I think just the internet age in general has kind of led to a lot of hopelessness and lack of purpose, and people feeling like they're not enough. I think specifically a lot of men recently have had the whole "I don't have purpose anymore" because I feel like a lot of people don't. I feel like traditional gender roles are difficult, but I feel like they might have also caused men to feel like they don't know what they're doing anymore. Because when they're told that, okay, so the one thing that your dad did and your granddad did and your great granddad did, which was like be the breadwinner and be the guy who runs the household, which is the thing that I feel like a lot of them kind of live for. I know at least
Mm,
a lot of them are quite, a lot of men are, older men are quite proud of the fact that they like helped their family and did all
mm,
these things.
mm.
A lot of men now are being told, but like you don't need to do that anymore. And I guess they're sat there going, so what am I needed for then? Do you think that has also caused a lot of disillusionment with life in general for a lot of men who don't actually know what purpose they serve anymore?
I mean, that is a massive research question so one of the studies that we did was to develop an agenda of research priorities for male suicide. So asking people with lived experience of this issue, what are the questions that are most important for us to look at? And one of those questions is around where do men who are suicidal find their purpose and meaning? I mean, it's an essential question for all human beings. Again, I haven't done any specific research on that to really address that question. It is something that I would like to look at in the future. But I think everything that you're describing is really um, potentially relevant. I think that, I think everybody, um, how to say this kind of in an appropriate way, I think that, it's for me as a woman who doesn't have children and never had any interest in children and doesn't enjoy domestic chores, like this new world where I can work and pursue education and do the things that fascinate and fulfill me and give me purpose and meaning is incredible. But I think that sometimes there's a sort of demonization of what we see as this sort of masculine impulse to want to protect and provide, which actually for me is a beautiful, in essence, that's beautiful that another human being wants to protect the people that they love and provide for the people that they love. For me, that's really, I think that's a kind of magical thing. And so I think it's how do we take that impulse and give it a place that's sort of going to be as beneficial as possible for sort of all people, but not to demonize that impulse. Do you know what I mean? Not to say that that's a thing about men being controlling or, you know, because it's for me something that's kind of extraordinary about human beings that we have the capacity to care so deeply and profoundly for those beyond. And I know, like on the Tim Men Instagram, George is so good at highlighting acts of masculine male protection that aren't directed to family members and loved ones, which, you know, on an evolutionary point of view makes much more sense. But, you know, acts of protection towards random strangers where men endanger their lives or, you know, in tragic cases die because they're trying to um, protect someone that they don't even know. For me, that's like incredibly extraordinary. And there has to be a way for that energy to be released and realized in the world. That's, you know, I'm not saying that men have to be that kind of
Yeah,
hero role, but those that want to be, it's an incredible quality. And well, in a way it's all rooted back to like the lens with which we view male behavior. Like there's a lens that we could look at that sees the worst of it or looks at it in the worst way. So looks at that impulse for protection and provision as a controlling behavior, or one
yeah.
that looks at it in a more compassionate and I think, you know, for the majority of men, honest light of like that desire to love, an expression of love.
I think it's a case of wanting to belong, really. I feel like a lot
Yeah,
of people just
for
don't know where
sure.
they belong. And I think that kind of ties into that. Obviously, I've been reading your work a lot, and one of the theories of suicide is social pain specifically. And I feel like that lack of belonging really ties into the fact that we, at the end of the day, we feel like we need to do the things we were built to do. We can't, a lot of the time, we can't help but have the impulses we have. So our survival instinct back in the past would have been to be part of a family or give people the care and support they want. And if you're now being told actually that role is no longer necessary, I feel like you're excluded from what you thought was your job almost.
And then I was going to say, additionally, led on to that, being told that actually you're toxic.
Yeah,
That's now
absolutely.
you've gone from being, you know, what it was in the past to now this sort of, you know, society viewing you as toxic. Where's the possibility for, you know, belonging, connection in that narrative? And again, you know, I go back to those research findings around how the dangers of cultural ideas that diminish men's relationship needs, you know, and you're sort of reinforcing that idea that men don't need a sense of connection and belonging, which is such a dangerous path to then start um, walking.
There's also a mention of on your Instagram page about how this kind of social pain can almost be associated with the same brain regions of physical pain. So you can't
Mm.
even distinguish, like it's so integral, this feeling of wanting to be part of something and not being able to, that your body almost feels it as physical pain, that inability to be part of something greater than just yourself.
Yeah, so they did. Some psychologists did some amazing experiments where they put people in in a brain scanner and engineered situations of exclusion or rejection. And then they scanned basically what happened in the brain when somebody experienced that. And they basically saw evidence to suggest that the same neural pathways that are triggered when you feel physical pain, like say somebody's punched you or something, those same sort of neural pathways seem to be activated when you experience a situation of social pain, of social exclusion, social rejection. And then people have hypothesized, well, why would that happen? Why would an experience of exclusion potentially trigger a pain response? And the hypothesis is that in the same way that like knowing that you're in physical danger is so imperative to an organism keeping safe. Like if I didn't feel a pain response to fire, I'm going to die very quickly. So my body needs to become attuned to physical danger and have a response mechanism for it. And these people are hypothesizing that in a similar way, at a certain point in our evolutionary history, it became so necessary for us to have social bonds, have belonging and connection, because we couldn't survive alone. That basically these pain networks almost got co-opted by the social world to be triggered in response to social danger as well, which um, is a theory. It's not. We don't know that for sure, but I mean, logically, it feels very. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm sure you've had experiences as well of like when you feel rejected or you feel excluded or you feel like you don't belong. In your body, like it feels horrendous. It feels in some ways it's worse than a lot of physical things, certainly for me, that I've gone through. And I find that such a moving idea in theory, because you start to look at everybody so much more differently. Like if somebody's going through a breakup, or somebody's been really badly bullied at work, or um, somebody's struggling to get anybody to go on a date with them, like all these different scenarios, or someone going through a bereavement, like all these different ways in which people can be living with like chronic and severe levels of like social pain that aren't visible necessarily to the rest of us. I find that tremendously moving.
That's obviously one of the theories of suicide that you've mentioned. What are some of the other key ones that seem to factor into potential reasons why people end up in that kind of state?
So that's a sort of social pain theory of suicide. There's another theory called the escape from self theory, which is about this idea that a person who's suicidal has this feeling that like life hasn't lived up to expectations, and blame for that is placed upon themselves, and so they start to create these very painful thoughts and feelings about themselves. And as those sort of painful ideas build, they may start to think of suicide as a way to escape themselves, to escape these painful feelings that they have about self. And certainly I see some evidence for that in some of the work that I do in men, particularly, is again going back to my earlier point about these feelings of failure that some men are living with. So the thing about theories is that suicide is such a complicated death. No one theory can explain every aspect of suicidal pain or be relevant to every suicidal person, because it's just too complicated. The thing about theories is to take what's useful from different ones to try and help you make sense for yourself of what you're going through. Another theory that I really, really find very helpful, it's called the fluid vulnerability theory. And it's this notion that everybody has a baseline risk for suicide because we all experience painful things in life. So everybody carries that baseline risk, but there'll be a point when that pain becomes so intense that a suicidal mode is activated. And when you're in that suicidal mode, that's when you're in a crisis and there's a potential danger to life.
There's like a tipping point.
Exactly. Yes. And you're then in this kind of sort of danger zone. But what I find helpful about that theory is that they suggest it's so intense to be in that emotional state that your body cannot sustain it. And so it becomes a cyclical thing. So for me, that's helpful to know when you're in that crisis, it will ebb and flow, which doesn't mean to say that you won't go into multiple crises over and over, but it's knowing that there will be some breaks within it. And what can you do in those moments of break to try and keep yourself a bit safer for when you go back um, into it? And then, eventually, with the right support and the right sort of safety plans, once the suicidal crisis has passed it for that period of time and you're back just in a sort of baseline risk mode, what's the work that you could do to try and resolve some of that baseline risk to stop you going into suicidal crisis again? But I'm posting on my Instagram a lot of content at the moment about theories of suicide because I'm really passionate about giving people this information to try and understand themselves a bit better and what might be going on for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people aren't aware of how they're aware they have the feelings, they're just not understanding the mechanisms of why or how they manifest in the first place. And I think having that understanding
Exactly.
can give people better mitigation methods. And these kind of
Exactly.
theories aren't particularly well known. They're just like, I feel like I don't want to live anymore, but I haven't been able to rationalize it myself other than just this is what's going on in my life. But then if they can see that applied to an understanding of psychologically why that's happening in the first place, they
Mm,
can then use that as a guideline to then recover.
exactly.
So I'd like to end just to say if somebody is struggling with suicide at the moment, what would be your recommended steps to take in if you're struggling at the moment?
It's always a complicated question to answer in a way because, as we've said throughout the podcast, what works for one person isn't going to work for another. I think that, first of all, I know when you're at that point where you don't want to be here anymore, you are in tremendous, tremendous, tremendous pain. My heart really goes out to anybody experiencing that because it is horrendous. And you can have all the safety plans in the world and the things that you would do to try and keep yourself away from the cliff edge. But when you're in that feeling, it's very hard to sometimes implement those things. So I just want to really acknowledge how brutal that can be. I think that it's using those moments, it's understand for me that last theory that I mentioned is so helpful because I apply that to myself as well, because I also have those sorts of feelings sometimes. And it's understanding that this too shall pass. And it's finding the strategies that will keep you safe as that storm passes through. And I don't want to make that sound like that's an easy thing to do because when you're in the grip of the storm, it's going to be it can be one of the most difficult tasks of your life. But it's understanding that this too shall pass and that there is, in those moments of it passing, exploring the different strategies that you need personally to help you regulate your pain. And I can't tell you what those things might be because it's sort of an individual journey that for many of us, it's a lifelong engagement. Like I will be regulating my mental health for the rest of my life. And my strategies for keeping myself well will change all of the time. And sometimes things that keep me well in one moment aren't effective another time that I use them. They might even make me, I'm a big football fan, and I know that sometimes the football will be such an incredible distraction, and I'll release emotions that I can't release during the day. I'm a big Liverpool fan. I cry every time I don't have a big cry, but like two or three tears will come out when I listen to You'll Never Walk Alone because it touches me so deeply. And I know that some of the pressure valve is releasing, but then I'll also watch the football and we'll have a shocking game or there'll be some big VAR injustice. And I'm in a worse emotional state than I was going in sometimes. So it's really knowing that it's sort of I think could be a sort of constant management thing. But to really, if you can, seek some human connection, I think that is because I think you feel so alone with your pain, but there are so many people that care deeply about it. I care deeply about it. You care deeply about it. This is my kind of life's work now, trying to um, understand that pain better and try and whatever sort of limited ways to get that pain better supported. So I hope there's some comfort in that. But of course, we cannot. What you want to do is reach in and take that pain out of the human being and send it to Mars, and that's not possible.
I think what you're doing is incredible nonetheless, even if you can't take away their pain physically. Just getting that message out there and doing the research of stuff that probably should have had more attention earlier, that's finally getting it
Yeah,
now from you. So
yeah.
if
Thank
people
you.
want to find more of you, where should they go?
The best place is Instagram. That's where I'm trying to post more regularly. So it's male underscore suicide underscore research. And then I also have a website called malesuicideresearch.com. And I've been putting together guides about our research findings and more sort of visually illustrated guides to sort of explain what we're finding so that people don't have to read very long jargon filled academic papers. So the website and Instagram are the main places.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. You've been an incredible
Pleasure.
guest, and it's such an important topic, and I'm definitely keep going and keep putting that message out there.